Tell me briefly how you came to research the disease we know as AIDS.
I was interested in a health plan for a large bank here in California in the early 80s, and in researching the actuarial data for that, my brother and I looked into the actuarial data for AIDS, and that's what led us into the AIDS literature initially, trying to determine how many patients, if we were to take care of this large group of people, 30,000 approximately, how many of them would develop AIDS and what it would cost us to care for them were we to become responsible for their care. And that's what led me originally into the literature, where I discovered basically that, in my opinion, the AIDS virus was not a spontaneous occurrence of nature, but creation of the laboratory.
Well, could you give me an explanation of how AIDS works against the immune system and the difference between B cells and T cells?
Okay, well, AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which a syndrome is a set or constellation of symptoms experienced by the patient, whereas AIDS is actually, by the definition, immune deficiency due to any particular cause, but in general it's referred to as caused by the reputative AIDS virus, which is thought to lead to a selective destroying or destruction of the immune system, particularly the T cell part. In the early 70s, doctors knew that the immune system was divided into two parts: the B cell system, which controlled bacterial infections, and the T cell system, which was thought to control development of cancers. And initially, in our opinion, the virus was constructed to selectively destroy the T cell system so that scientists could see a rise of cancers that were then come out as the T cell system was selectively destroyed. And that's basically what they wrote down at the time in 1970 when they said specifically, let's make a virus that selectively destroys the T cell system.
You're saying that they actually created this disease intentionally to study the effects?
Our impression is they created the virus intentionally to destroy the T cell system intentionally so they could see cancers arise. And that's written down. Now, if you want to look specifically, it's in the Bulletin of the World Health Organization, volume 47, page 257, 1972.
I see. Now, could you explain the difference between, say, the AIDS virus and some of the related viruses such as T cell and hairy cell leukemia?
Yeah, well, there's a host of viruses that have been discovered since 1980 or so, including the AIDS virus, which are human retroviruses. Retroviruses being viruses that are RNA in nature and that infect cells, duplicate themselves into a DNA form, and then insert themselves into the genome or into the DNA of the organism, thereby becoming an integral part of the organism and subsequently reproducing themselves and making more viruses. Those viruses, so-called retroviruses, are human T-cell leukemia virus, which was HTLV1, hairy cell leukemia virus, HTLV2, and HTLV3, the human AIDS virus. Those were the first three described and discovered by Gallo and Montagnier and others in the early 1980s. There are exact duplicates of these viruses growing in cattle and sheep and cats and other animals. And basically, it's our belief that these viruses in humans really represent nothing more than the cross-species or interspecies transfer of these viruses from animals into man. Even today, most so-called AIDS experts actually state that the human AIDS virus probably came from primates to man, which of course would constitute a cross-species transfer from an animal, a primate, an ape, or some other primate, into human beings. So no matter what you believe, they have by that theory at least verified our initial contention, which was basically we had three contentions. One was the AIDS virus was the zoonosis, in other words, that it came from animals and it was a transfer into human beings. So that we would agree with them completely. Our disagreeing would be upon which species it came from. We would say it came from cattle and sheep or cats, and they would say that it came from primates. More particularly then, we would say that the progenitor virus was bovine leukemia virus crossed with visna virus, making bovine visna virus in animals. particularly cattle, which was adapted artificially to humans by growing the virus in human tissue culture. And they would say that the virus spontaneously mutated in primates and would have spontaneously have adapted itself to grow in human beings. We don't believe that's really possible on the scale that these events have happened. In other words, the fact that there are a host of these different agents growing in humans makes that relatively impossible. Then we would thirdly say that the virus is spread as a result of vaccine campaigns that were conducted around the world. And they would say that the virus spread spontaneously again.
So you're saying basically the contention that AIDS beginning as a simian T-cell leukemia virus in African green monkeys is an unlikely scenario?
We think it's very unlikely. In other words, there's a host of phenomena that prove that that's not true. Among them is the fact that in the early 1970s, scientists were looking for evidence of these kinds of diseases in primates and couldn't find them. In fact, they were injecting primates with these kinds of viruses and trying to get them to grow there, which is our contention for how these diseases end up running in primates. If these diseases had existed in primates for any period of time, then there would be no primates, just as there may be no humans in the near future, because they are just as adept at killing primates as they are at killing humans. And so had these diseases existed in primates for hundreds or thousands of years, we think they would have exterminated primates just as effectively as they're about to exterminate humans.
So, so the feeling here is that combining a bovine leukemia virus and either a bovine visnovirus or a sheep visnovirus, I'm not sure which one that is.
Well, we think that the original AIDS virus was a virus named bovine visnovirus, which is virtually identical to the AIDS virus in humans, except that that virus grows in cattle. And we think that virus was produced by crossing bovine leukemia virus of cattle with visnovirus of sheep, and that could have occurred either intentionally or accidentally because there was cross-species transfer of serum between cattle and sheep. It's been going on for a long period of time by veterinarians, and either unknowingly or knowingly it would have allow for these viruses to get together. Knowingly, you look at how, if you wanted to produce a selective T-cell destroyer, you would naturally take bovine leukemia virus, which was a T-cell and B-cell attacker of cattle, and cross it with visnovirus, which was the great destroyer virus, to produce potentially a selective T-cell destroying virus, which we believe is bovine visnovirus, which is a T-cell destroying virus of cattle. And then you could manipulate that virus in the laboratory very easily by growing it in human tissue culture and adapting it artificially or changing it, forcing its mutation into a, quote, human retrovirus.
Now, what would be the pluses? Why would somebody want to create?
It's written down, as I already said. It's said that they wanted to make that virus so they could selectively destroy the T-cell system. And that would allow them to see the arisal of cancer and promote other infections that they were studying at the time. There's been a great deal of research and also construction of viruses that cause cancer. There are literally hundreds of papers on this topic from the early 60s and 70s, and they produced several viruses in the laboratory which were cancer-causing, which were new, which were artificially produced. That's irrefutable. There are literally thousands of papers on that.
Okay, so my next question was, has there ever been a case where a retrovirus that grew solely in an animal has been adapted to solely grow in humans? And I think for the most part.
Well, I think that AIDS and all of the other human retroviruses are exact evidence of that. I don't believe that these viruses occurred spontaneously and adapted themselves spontaneously in nature to grow in human beings. Clearly now there has been a retrovirus identified that was a simian retrovirus, particularly Mason-Pfizer monkey virus, which has been evidenced. A recent article in Science clearly demonstrated this virus had been grown in the laboratories and now is growing in 2 laboratory workers. And so it's clear that these viruses can cross a species barrier by manipulation in the laboratory.
Now that brings up an interesting point about laboratory workers and possibly other people who could be infected by laboratory accidents or accidental release. of viruses.
That's been a topic that's been discussed ad infinitum also, and there have been entire conferences and books written on that. In fact, if you address the Astronomar conferences of the early 1970s, when scientists got together and addressed what they were going to do when some of these creations that they were developing in their laboratories escaped, how they would contend with that very problem. And again, I would say that the AIDS virus is just a realization of that fear, and that they haven't contended with it well at all. Clemenson in the early 70s also wrote about that when he predicted this very condition. That he said that scientists were creating viruses that would cause epidemics of cancer and AIDS-like diseases and would kill millions and millions of people worldwide. He said and predicted that they would kill more than the 1918 flu epidemic, which killed a fifth to a third of the world's population.
So the feeling is that yes, it has been predicted, and I guess the feeling is also that it was requested.
In a sense, that's what we call a prediction. Clemenson's work, which clearly talks about the release of new agents into the environment that would have come from animals and have been artificially mutated or changed in the laboratory to grow in human beings. He talks about that in the mid-1970s. The request, we think, basically was the papers that addressed production of viruses that would either selectively destroy various aspects of the immune system, the T-cell system, the B-cell system, or inhibit macrophages selectively, and also the making of viruses that would cause leukemia or solid tumors specifically. And that's been, again, hundreds of papers and hundreds of viruses produced that have that capability.
How did AIDS come to be so widespread, and first of all, in men, women, and children equally in Africa?
We think that AIDS was spread in Africa as a result of vaccine programs that were conducted there, either accidentally or intentionally. Again, smallpox vaccine may have been contaminated with the AIDS virus and spread as a result heterosexual disease in Africa. Whereas in the United States, it may have been spread in a vaccine population, homosexual men that receive vaccines and thus be, quote, a homosexual disease in this country.
Do you feel that these groups were specifically targeted, or?
Well, they were obviously targeted, and the vaccines were conducted in vaccine programs were conducted in them. But I don't feel necessarily that they were targeted in any other way.
Right. Now, there's also the Haitian connection.
Yeah, the Haitian connection is proven to be, of course, totally false. And if you look at the Caribbean now, the other countries in the Caribbean are just as infected with AIDS as the Haitians. So that was somehow, just a smoke screen set up to.
How about the fact that there was 14 to 15,000 Haitian workers in Central Africa at the time of the 70 inoculation?
Oh yeah, that's probably the mechanism of infection of Haitians, but it also is the mechanism of infection of others in Caribbean.
Is AIDS considered a sexually transmitted disease?
It's considered by many to be a sexually transmitted disease. However, there's no evidence of that. No more evidence that AIDS is a sexually transmitted disease than, say, smallpox or chickenpox, both of which are, of course, transmitted during sex, but neither of which is a sexually transmitted disease. Just the fact that the disease is transferred during intercourse does not constitute, in my books, a sexually transmitted disease. There are really 4 characteristics of truly sexually transmitted diseases. Diseases such as gonorrhea and syphilis are, in fact, sexually transmitted diseases. And they are because they satisfy 4 characteristics. They are primarily diseases that grow in the venereal tract. They're diseases that live on mucous membranes and thus tend to die rapidly outside of moist, wet surfaces. They're present in high concentrations in the venereal tract, and they're primarily transferred by sex. Now, AIDS does not grow selectively or even inselectively in the venereal tract. It's virtually non-existent in secretions of the venereal tract. It lives for at least 10 days on a dry windowsill in Paris, France, as published by the French several years ago. And there's no evidence whatsoever that it's primarily transferred by sex. So I don't think that AIDS is a sexually transmitted disease.
Well, is it not found in high concentrations in semen?
No, it's not. It's virtually non-existent in semen. It only exists at a concentration of or less than 1 free virus particle per milliliter in semen. So in a total ejaculate, you might have 3 or 5 AIDS viruses total. It's primarily transferred, in our opinion, by cells, macrophages. large white blood killer cells, which job it is to destroy garbage that we find in our bodies. And we think that in a so-called Trojan horse type phenomena, that these cells carry the virus inside of them and transfer it between people.
So virtually you can catch it wherever there is an exchange of cellular material.
Cellular material, correctly. And that would include anal sex, oral sex, vaginal intercourse, mucous membrane transfer of cells, or braided skin, if you could allow that cell to penetrate to braided skin. Macrophages are mobile, amoeboid-like organisms that have the ability to transfer themselves across membranes. And so anywhere there's a mucous membrane, a membrane that would allow that to occur, you could account for AIDS transfer, which explains transfer of the virus across the vagina, the rectum, the oral mucosa, the membranes of the eye, all of which have been identified. It explains transfer of the virus from mothers to babies by breastfeeding, and it explains equally well transfer of the virus from babies that were infected to mothers that were not infected by breastfeeding.
And I imagine that kissing is...
Well, obviously, yeah, we think that a virus can be transferred. Just as babies transferred it to their mothers by breastfeeding, we think it's equally effective that kissing, particularly exchange of saliva and cells in the saliva, would transfer the virus.
So, well, what if I use a condom? Will that protect me from...
If you have a total body condom, other than that, it's very little, if any, protection. For a host of reasons. One, condoms fail, condoms have holes in them. Natural condoms are known not to be effective, and plus if you look at the history of condom protection of infection of sperm, i.e. pregnancy, you can only become pregnant 3 or 4 days out of the month, theoretically, on the average. And condoms are known to fail there about 10% of the time. So if you can become infected 30 days out of the month, 100% of the time, you would expect a much higher failure rate anyway. So, plus the fact that we believe that saliva is potential transfer, so using a condom may reduce your risk somewhat, but certainly not 100%.
Well then, if it can be transferred through that cellular mechanism, then I would think that even vectors, or say mosquitoes.
Well, sure. Mosquito transfer has never been disproven, although, it's, quote, never been proven. But there's ever evidence to believe that the virus can be transferred by vectors, particularly since every known close relative of the AIDS virus, particularly equine infectious anemia virus, Caprine arthritis encephalitis virus, bovine leukemia virus, Visna virus. All these viruses are vector transfer. In other words, every close relative of AIDS is transferred by blood-sucking insects, either mosquitoes or tabenid flies or a host of other blood-sucking insects. So to say that AIDS a priori is not transferred by those same exact mechanisms, to me, seems a little strange. In other words, I think it's very probable, plus the fact that known mechanism of feeding by mosquitoes. A mosquito ingests an average of 5 to 7 white blood cells during each feeding, which can exist alive inside the stomach of mosquitoes for up to 5 to 7 days, and then be regurgitated during the next feeding. So it would appear to me to be very likely that AIDS and the AIDS-like viruses can be transferred during blood sucking by various vectors.
Would that contribute to the spread in, say, Central Africa, where
right, we think that constitutes a major mechanism of transfer, particularly among children in Africa, where there's really no evidence of sexual intercourse.
Well, as far as the treatments go, currently the establishment is holding AZT as being the drug of choice, along with DDI and DDC.
Right, these are the only drugs approved. They're the only treatments available today. But nobody survived AIDS that I'm aware of, short of one person who spontaneously, miraculously cured himself without any therapy, actually. But other than that, one spontaneous resolution that I'm aware of. And he actually did have the virus cultured from his blood and spinal fluid, and he had a T-cell count less than 10. And then subsequently was unable to culture the virus from his blood or spinal fluid, and his immune system had been restored to normal. So that's what I call a cure, in a sense. And the real evidence of that would be that he lives a healthy life for the next 40 years and dies at age 80 of an MI. Short of that, I've not seen anybody really recover from this problem with any therapy, period.
So it's just really a non-effective drug, then?
As Gallo says, you give this virus to Superman, he'll likely die of AIDS.
Well, I mean, will there ever be a vaccine or a cure?
I don't think there. I think that the cure will come from the development of pulse electromagnetic radiation, which properly identifies the virus selectively and then destroys it uniquely. And that will come out of physics, a physical problem, research actually in the electromagnetics of molecules, particularly macromolecules, in this case a virus, and figuring out what kind of energy characteristics they have, and then using those to selectively destroy the virus, in this case the AIDS virus, or any other virus that we're infected with.
Well, okay, say my T cell counts were very low. If I can bring them back up through an alternative therapy, I still have really not solved the problem.
No, you haven't, because there's no evidence that will be maintained for any period of time. Because these, first off, are very slow viruses. Just because your T cell counts go down and come back up over any period of time, and I'm talking about a short period of time, 1 or 2 years, means nothing. These viruses act in general, over 20% of the lifespan of the species they're in. So you have to look at a long period of time, 10 or 14 years, to get a handle on what's actually occurring. So if you could reconstitute yourself from, say, 0 back up to 600 or 700, now that would be, in my opinion, some effective treatment. I'd like to see the results of anybody who could do that over 10 or 14 years. But I haven't seen anybody who can get those kinds of results with any kind of therapy or combination of therapies.
Hey, Dr. Strecker, could you tell me briefly how you came to research the disease we know as AIDS?
I was interested in a health plan for a large bank here in California in the early 80s, and in researching the actuarial data for that, my brother and I looked into the actuarial data for AIDS, and that's what led us into the AIDS literature initially, trying to determine how many patients, if we were to take care of this large group of people, 30,000 approximately, how many of them would develop AIDS and what it would cost us to care for them were we to become responsible for their care. And that's what led me originally into the literature, where I discovered basically that, in my opinion, the AIDS virus was not a spontaneous occurrence of nature, but creation of a laboratory.
Well, could you give me an explanation of how AIDS works against the immune system and the difference between B cells and T cells?
Okay, well, AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which a syndrome is a set or constellation of symptoms experienced by the patient, whereas AIDS is actually, by the definition, immune deficiency due to any particular cause, but in general it's referred to as caused by the reputative AIDS virus, which is thought to lead to a selective destroying or destruction of the immune system, particularly the T cell part. In the early 70s, doctors knew that the immune system was divided into two parts: the B cell system, which controlled bacterial infections, and the T cell system, which was thought to control development of cancers. And initially, in our opinion, the World Health Organization, volume 47, page 257, 1972.
I see. Now, could you explain the difference between, say, the AIDS virus and some of the related viruses such as T cell and hairy cell leukemia?
Yeah, well, there's a host of viruses that have been discovered since 1980 or so, including the AIDS virus, which are human retroviruses. Retroviruses being viruses that are RNA in nature and that infect cells, duplicate themselves into a DNA form, and then the virus was constructed to selectively destroy the T cell system so that scientists could see arise cancers that were then come out as the T cell system was selectively destroyed. And that's basically what they wrote down at the time in 1970 when they said specifically, let's make a virus that selectively destroys the T cell system.
You're saying that they actually created this disease intentionally to study the effects?
Our impression is they created the virus intentionally to destroy the T cell system intentionally so they could see cancers arise, and that's written down. Now, if you want to look specifically, it's in the bulletin